Okay, so I'm going to show you how to transfer your tessellation design. Hopefully you watched the tessellation video to figure out how to get the cut and fold or cut and paste method. But really it's just, you can guys kind of see if I kind of fold my pieces down that I've taped. I just cut out a square and then kind of slid things over and taped them, right? So I consider this the back of my design. I drew on the other side. So this is some kind of process that you can do with your tessellation, especially because we're cutting it from a block, is that you can add details in already instead of having to hand draw them. So you have like the whole complete shape where you can just cut that out or cut out around it and print that like a flat color, or you can cut out actual designs and print that as like, you know, like the black ink drawing and then fill the color in manually with a monotype, a monoprint, that kind of thing. So I'm going to show you a couple different ways of how to, you know, transfer this to your block. Something I like to do though, just to get a sense, because I'm going to do both one that's like just the flat kind of full shape, and then also one that's designed. So what I like to do, especially if I'm trying to get an idea of what my design's going to look like, because, you know, shading with pencil, sorry, I just realized my fan was still on. Shading with pencil, you know, for your design is great to help you get value, but that's not how printmaking works. You really have to think in that kind of like close proximity, black ink only, that kind of way of shading. So you can go over some of your drawn lines. So let's say I wanted an outline. Now these are really thin lines, even though this is a medium pen, right? So even though, you know, I'm kind of outlining my shape, I'm gonna go ahead and step up my pen size. This is a bold pen that I like to use. So, you know, when I'm printing, or when I'm carving, I should say, I'm gonna leave that outline. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of fill this in. I want that thick, bold outline to be on the edge. You guys can see I'm starting to lose some of my shapes, but what that means, oh, got that on the block, is I can kind of fill in, see what this is gonna look like printed, and then, you know, it's gonna help me adjust things as I carve, right? So if you know, this area is a little hard to differentiate, you know, I'd not do that as bold. Just gonna kind of fill in this design here just to kind of get an idea. And this is something you can do in your sketchbook too. So if you have your actually tessellated shape and you like the way it came out, you can play around with like how you want to, you know, develop the interior of the design, which can be just as fun and useful. And this is, you know, this is that extra step. You don't have to do this. I like to do this because it helps me see. It helps me visualize what the print is going to look like in the end. Sorry, that's my phone. So I'm just going to do this pretty quickly just to show. And I'm doing this one of two reasons. I'm going to show you guys how you can use tracing paper, which I will have readily available in the studio, to get your block design. So if this is the way I wanted it to be, with printmaking, if you looked at the presentation, if I just traced it like this, it's gonna print backwards, right? It's the whole, you always have to think in mirror images. So I'm okay with this design being flipped, right? So in reality, these, when I do this, they're gonna look backwards, right? So if I did this and traced it on the block just as is, which is what I'm gonna do just to show you guys, it's gonna flip backwards, right? So, you know, you always have to think in kind of mirror images, but just to kind of see, and this is something you can do, you know, in the design process. I find that something like this helps because it not only helps me visualize what it's gonna look like, especially if you're adding details in, you know, in the actual block design, but it allows you to see, you know, do I need to make adjustments? Is this actually how I want it to look? That kind of thing. So I'm just gonna whiz around here really quick. And this is also, you know, this is a pretty abstract shape on its own. So how you develop the inside can give you a lot more freedom to play with, you know, other concepts of your design. It can be your time to kind of let more of your like personal aesthetic and voice shine through. And it's just really fun. Just period. It's fun to develop the interior of a tessellated shape, right? So if you're looking for something that's more just kind of bold and more like a pattern-based graphic, great. I'm only gonna do like a couple of those teeth. And the reason I'm using such a thick marker to outline, right, because I could draw these details in, is realistically, for anyone that has like, this is a new process, this kind of relief printing and carving method, getting those small gaps is a little tricky, right? So, you know, something I like to do, this is how my design's gonna print once I cut it out. I'm also gonna do the back design as well. So you can do this method, and so you can trace it directly on the block. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna line up the flat shapes of these two top little creatures, right? So that's not something I have to cut, it's one less step to do. So you can kind of line up your shape on your block. I like to add a little bit of tape. Blue painter's tape works. Any kind of tape will work. You can put it on the back side. I like to kind of do this where I kind of do and have it here so then it's easy to flip over. And so this is some tracing paper. It's black carbon paper. You can see I've used it for a design before, but it should come off with a little bit of kind of like graphite or soot-ish. They have white tracing paper as well where it's like a more of a white residue. It's really hard to see on these blocks. This is more of the kind of block material we would be using. I didn't have one in my studio at the time, so I'm using linoleum, which is gonna be a little harder to cut, which is why we're using this. But so to kind of gear myself up, what happens is this is my design. It goes in between, kind of scoot this up a little bit. It goes in between your template and your block. And then I like to take like an ebony pencil or something that has not a very sharp pencil, right? So something that's a little dull, and I'm just gonna retrace my lines. And this is also why that kind of outlining comes into effect and is helpful. I realize I just lost the detail of the one creature, that's okay. Go around, and this is pretty loose, right? So, you know, as much as you want the tessellation to be perfect, and what you could do for the whole shape is actually go around the outside of it, so that way if your lines end up, you know, maybe you cut a little too much off, that's going to be really helpful. So you have a little more wiggle room, and it can just get you a thicker outline, right? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go around this part instead of trying to trace around the outline that I drew on just to see what it's going to look like. And I'm pressing pretty hard. You don't have to like, you know, push your whole pen or dull pencil through the space. But if the carbon paper is new, right, this one's a little old, so we're going to see how well this works. If the carbon paper is new, you should always get that faint line. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do next, right? So this is how I want my design to look. Let's just flip them over. See, nice little line. Ta-da! Right, so here's my shape. And what I like to do is I kind of like to flip this back over. I like to always kind of check and look at my block. See, this was just like an extra line. That could have come for, I think that was the Sharpie line I did, right? So I know that this is supposed to connect to the edge, right? Because that's that flat space of the edge. And here's some of the design I was working on the interior space. But now I'm going to go around the whole edge again. And what you can do, because this does kind of like, after a little bit of time, it can wipe off. What you can do is you can take a permanent marker and go around the outline, so then it's very clear about what parts of your design you want to save and what parts are meant to be carved away, right? So now I have this bold, thick line, and I'm ready to go, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and leave this one. This is my like full shape, right? And so basically what's gonna happen is I'm gonna cut out all of these spaces with my lino cutter. Ta-da! And then I will, you know, I always like to proof my block before we go, right? So that's one way, is you can start like, you know, you trace it with your paper. That's one way to get it on. Another way, especially when it comes to the interior space, I'm gonna go ahead and trace my second block. So I'm gonna show you both ways of working. Kind of reset this here. And when it comes to this pieces, it doesn't necessarily matter if they're lined up perfect. I mean, you can do that. I know a lot of people that will like line up their blocks perfect. I'm not planning on printing like a couple colors, so it doesn't really matter. But what I like to do too, so I can actually see more of the shape, is I'll typically cut around this, right? So instead of carving out all of this space, I'll cut around as close as I can and then carve out the little bit after, right? So then I'm not wasting a whole bunch of linoleum by carving it out, but it allows me to register a little easier, especially when you're printing by hand and you're printing a pattern. This is all stuff I'm gonna go over in class as well. So If you're not getting it on the video, that's all right. So I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna trace around my shape. Ooh, how close am I to that edge? Pretty close, but I think we'll manage. Sneaky sneaks. All right, so just tracing around the edge. And it's okay if, if the design isn't perfectly tessellated, you most likely in the printing process, you're gonna get some overlap in your colors, especially the first couple like proofs that you try. So it's okay if it's not perfect, right? And that's why I suggest having that like thicker outline for your shape or incorporating that outline in some essence, even if it's after the printing process, because it's just going to be easier for you to register or add like a pin line in later and go from there, right? So I have my shape again. That looked weird for a second, but so this is, we got the same shape. Like to kind of, carve it up a little bit. So what I'm going to do this time is, I'm not totally married to any of, oh, I'll tape the tape off my little guy. I hope it doesn't, yep, there it goes. I did this with sketchbook paper, which is why it's so thin. It's okay, you just lost a few eyeballs. We can put that back in. All right. So I know I want that thicker outline. What I can do now is I can draw directly on the block and just kind of redo what I did here. Now, if your design's really intricate, highly recommend you just take the time, really be patient, use the carbon paper and transfer your block that way. If you wanted it to be mirrored, you can take something like this to the light box, retrace on the other side, and then if you wanted it to look exactly like this and have like these two creatures face that way, all you gotta do is flip the design, trace on the back, and do it that way with a light box, which is possible. We have a light box in the room. A window also works just as great. But what I'm gonna do now, I like to be able, I have to, I'm only getting older here. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take, this is a pretty washable marker, so it's gonna come off, in the process. Oftentimes I'll just use Sharpie. Now Sharpie usually doesn't come off without acetone. Which is fine for these blocks. That's why I like these ebony pencils, especially for more of the rubber blocks, is that, it kind of wipes off if you really, really scrub it, but it keeps your line pretty well. I like to do this because I like to be able to differentiate between what I'm trying to cut out and what I'm trying to save. Because if this is, I do printmaking like this all the time. This is like pretty much my wheelhouse. This is what I like to do in my own studio. But for those that are, just new to it, or even myself, I make mistakes all the time. It's pretty easy to get lost in what lines you're supposed to keep, right? So I'm gonna take this medium tipped pen and kind of add back in some of my little creature motifs here. He's pretty wicked. And I'm just drawing directly on the block. This is gonna help me in the long run. I'm just gonna give him 3 teeth. I think 4 was too many. And these are pretty thin lines. Now I could cut the lines out that thin. That's really not a problem. I'm gonna darken them up a little bit in the actual process, because one thing I've definitely learned about printmaking over the years, it's really easy to take things away. You can't put these pieces back in once you cut them out. So, you just kind of have to always be mindful of that essence, right? So I'm going to go here and make some of these divisions, bring back my little kind of like creature heads. And this is just one way that you guys can kind of add more flair to your tessellation, especially if the idea of just printing, a repeat pattern is like, why are we doing this type thing. This is a pretty good process to kind of learn and have in your skills, your life skills. And you guys can see this isn't 100% the same. This is the good thing about redrawing it. Not only is it going to help you practice your drawing skills, which is always important, but you can make those subtle changes, right? So if there's something in the initial design that you didn't love, then you can fix it in this one, right? So I'm going to fill that in because this is something I know that I'm going to keep. It also helps to kind of fill in the shapes that you think that, you're going to forget that like, oh, that's not a line, that's supposed to be a full shape, because worst comes to worst, if you don't like it as a full shape, I can take material away after you proof it, but you can't put it back in once it's there, right? So it's just, one of those very important things that you got to keep track of you can't always take away. This is a very worried creature. Can't put those things back, right? It lets you kind of play around with your design in post-production a little bit. All right, so kind of redrew all my creatures. Now what I can do after that is I can take another marker and play around with the line thickness. This too, you know, thickening up the lines is just going to give you that option. If you do accidentally cut into it, that's okay, right? Because you can always edit. It doesn't have to meet up 100%, but I'm just going to kind of show you what the line thickness I want is around the outside edge. But remember, I'm not going to do a video of me cutting out these because that would take a couple hours. That'd be more like a time lapse. But I will show you what the end result is in the printing demo of each block and show you what they look like. Because the whole interior design is something that you can do afterwards. You can draw that in if you don't want to, if you think just carving this part is going to be, you know, good enough for you as far as like technical skills and learning a new process, then go for it. You don't have to add all these interior things in. Okay, so it's pretty much the line thickness that I want for each. I'm going to thicken up these lines a little bit later, but general idea of how you transfer your design to your block. So you have two options, right? You have multiple options, but two that are pretty good. You can trace your actually like tessellation that you made using the like cut and paste method that I showed you in the other video. It's really simple. It's just an easy way to like play around with shapes. And I use an index card, right? Just kind of cut a square out of an index card and went from there. You can definitely use rectangles. Any shape that's like already kind of interlocking in nature is good for this method, right? So I've seen people use triangles, hexagons. You can get as elaborate as you want, right? But just be wary, the more elaborate your shape initially, you know, you're really having to think a little bit how those fit together. So you can use the cut and paste method and just kind of trace along. You don't even have to use the carbon paper for that. You can literally just trace these. But the carbon paper is going to be good if you have more interior designs like this. And just remember that if this is how you want it to look, you're going to have to do it the mirrored way, right? And I'm going to show you more of what that looks like in class. I've done it 1,000 times. You also could just, you know, be okay with it printing backwards, right? If you're not married to how this looks, then, you know, it's just going to print the opposite direction. But that's the kind of gist of how to transfer your design to your block, and we'll go from there.